Hi, this is Paul. I want to talk about the Netflix sitcom Nobody Wants This. Kristen Bell also did The Good Place, which was a very interesting show that was religion adjacent, let's say. And now she does Nobody Wants This, which is a sitcom on Netflix. Now, sitcoms, if you go on YouTube and type in sitcoms have sort of fallen into hard times. Sitcoms, situation comedies were sort of the bread and butter of network TV when I was growing up. You had Happy Days, you had All in the Family, you had The Jeffersons, you had all these sitcoms, and sitcoms could sort of wrestle with, like All in the Family wrestle with a bunch of issues for today. And I think in some ways, Nobody Wants This tries to do a similar thing. Now, there is a trailer up on YouTube. I won't play it because, you never quite know how YouTube or the people who do these things feel. And there might be a few well, I guess there will be spoilers in this. But the show isn't really about surprises. It's quite well written. It's a bit raunchy. And it's about religion and sex. Now, the premise is that these two sisters are podcasters, and they're about to get a big contract from Spotify. They're basically going to sort of go, why is this camera soft focus? Hang on. We don't want soft focus. We want hard focus. So they are podcasters who are about to get their big break with a contract with Spotify, and they are two single women who mostly talk about their failures in dating and sex. And so that's sort of the premise. So this is female podcasting. Now, when I talked about this program a little bit, some people said, well, these are the top podcasts with women, and I didn't know any of them. So apparently there is a thriving area of podcasting in that space. Basically what happens is that Kristen Bell, who's the one who is here, her love life is sort of a mess. She's always dating the wrong men. Never really got up into, not a lot of talk about the biological clock or anything like that, but clearly she's out of her 20s. Sorry, just looks that way. And she goes to a party, and she basically hears that there's a rabbi there, and then she's chatting with him, and he of course is the rabbi. He's the hot rabbi, and the rabbi just recently is at this party because he broke up with his fiancée, and his fiancée was exactly the kind of wife that a young rabbi should have in this Los Angeles Jewish community. And he just broke up with her. He just sort of felt that this wasn't going the way he wanted, and then he meets Kristen Bell at this party, and he starts talking with their mutual friend about her, and it's right there in the trailer. And her mutual friend, this gives you a sense of the kind of writing. Her mutual friend says, well, she doesn't have a Jewish bone in her body unless you place one there. So like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more, say no more. And so, of course, she's interested, and his Jewish ritual and traditions they're meaningful. And I've been listening to a lot of Nathan Jacobs in the work that he's done on the nuns. And she would be someone who, she hasn't left religion. She didn't grow up religious. Her mother and father divorced because her father came out as gay, but her mother's just super trying to be affirming. There is, as in The Good Place, there is a level of honesty here about a lot of contemporary progressive narratives. So in other words, the money, even though she's on the surface super supportive of her husband and her husband's new lovers, etc., even though they're divorced, she also will admit that this does hurt, and there are a lot of issues. So of course, the romance continues, and now this is a junior rabbi in a progressive synagogue. They don't, of course, get into the realm of Jewish denominations, but There are female rabbis in this, and I know some members of our audience will have opinions about this, and you can go ahead and put them in the comment section. You know who you are. You know what you call this because anyway. But there are absolutely no compulsions for this rabbi about having sex with this woman who will eventually become his girlfriend. Now, this is going to start some things because, well, how will she fit in the synagogue? There'll be pressure for her to convert. She'll have to decide if she's in or out. And then you can almost do the whole thing just through the trailer here, which is typical for trailers. Needleman from Groundhog Day, very accomplished actor. He is the senior rabbi, and the senior rabbi is getting ready to retire. And the young hot rabbi wants to take his spot as senior rabbi because this is always what he's done. But again, there's no sense that in this, there's no sense that the Jewish community has a sexual norm apart from the current American standards. Okay? I'll just say it that way. And he's all excited because he's going to get promoted to the senior rabbi position. But it was really interesting in even the show notes under the trailer, they pretty much put the whole, I think there's 8 episodes of the first season of this on Netflix, and at the end of it, they announced that it was re-upped for another season, which is good because they left a lot of things sort of hanging in the air. An agnostic sex podcaster and newly single rabbi fall in love, but can their relationship survive their wildly different lives and meddling families? So, their wildly different lives and meddling families. Now, wildly different lives goes code for, well, if she doesn't convert, will even this enormously progressive and wealthy, I mean, if there's a mainline synagogue or temple, this is it. They seem to have all sorts of money. They have multiple staff. They have beautiful facilities. The rabbis are always sort of working on the donors, and there's a board that has to be dealt with, and there's some conservative voices in the board and more progressive voices in the board. But the question really is, where do religion and sexuality sort of, how do they deal with? Now, apparently with this show, there's absolutely no conversation or question about extramarital sex. There's no, the real question is, will he dare to marry this woman? Because marrying this woman will both put a crimp in his career aspirations, and also the family starts talking about it because as the season progresses, there's a little bit of romantic tension between Kristen Bell's sister and the hot rabbi's brother, who is already married to the right Jewish girl, and they have a daughter, and the daughter is having her bat mitzvah, and the mother is meddling in all of this, but the mother she's a controlling mother, she's a devouring mother, and she was not down with her son breaking off the engagement, and she's definitely not down with her son potentially falling in love or having a girlfriend as outside of them. Let's see. There's the mom, and so there's tension between the mom, and it's also very interesting because at one point the mom sort of has the Kristen Bell character in a corner, but Kristen Bell came to the family gathering with prosciutto because she thought prosciutto was beef instead of pork, but of course everyone there knew that prosciutto was pork, so apparently the Judaism of this synagogue doesn't impinge on anybody's sexuality, but it does impinge on their diet. But then she discovers that the mother this was her gift to the family for the big meeting to try and find acceptance with the family. And then the mother made a big deal about throwing away the prosciutto, but then Christian Bell catches mom in the kitchen. She had pulled the prosciutto out and she's just hungry for the prosciutto. So mom is hungry for the prosciutto, and son is hungry for the shiksa. And that's sort of how this thing then develops. And then for a while, she's like, well, here's the, let's see, where's the mother? Is the mother coming in? Oh, yeah, then there's this scene in this adult store with vibrators because she's going to review the vibrators only on Netflix. So it's all right there. It's that kind of tension. And what's interesting is, well, there's just a number of interesting things. I think, again, it's interesting that Kristen Bell has, again, I don't know the Hollywood hierarchy. I would imagine she's fairly high up. I haven't seen her in a lot of things. I mostly saw her in The Good Place. I think she got famous for doing some other thing before then. I haven't looked it up in IMDb because I generally don't do near enough research before I do a video. I'm just spouting off the top of my head. So you can unsubscribe and click away now if that makes you crazy. But The Good Place had a lot of rich religious adjacent stuff in it. Had a lot of rich theological things in it. And this show also has a lot of rich theological things in it. So I think actually the show provokes, and Mark D. Parker is using this show for a conversation with a group of people. And I think if the show is appropriate for the filters of that group of people, I think it is a good show to provoke discussion. And so in that sense, it sort of, in some ways, falls along the lines of All in the Family as a sitcom that is intended to provoke social discussion about social norms. There are a lot of interesting levels with this in terms of, I really wondered if the focus of the show was on a Christian family, how that would go. And in many ways, it gets into this current fascination with the spiritual or spirituality. Now, I first noticed Nathan Jacobs when he did a talk with a group of Orthodox clergy. And now on his channel, episode 7 and 8, he has gotten into the anatomy of the religiously unaffiliated, and he's now doing some shorts, which makes his videos tend to be quite long, so the shorts are good sort of entries into the video. But this is, of course, something that he has mined quite a bit. And both episodes are really outstanding, and I can recommend them. Nathan points out that, well, let's just hear him say it.
And so that means that the clear majority of nuns still believe in something. It's not that the new atheists have sort of like beat belief in God out of them. But there's also another problem with this. The sort of new atheist worldview is really sort of a materialist worldview. It's something that is skeptical not just about God, but about ghosts, about the soul, about the paranormal generally, that sort of thing. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at the non-affiliated, they actually have a host of broadly spiritual beliefs that don't fit into that materialist worldview. So the majority of the nuns, many of them profess belief in karma or fate. We'll talk about that in greater detail. Most of them consider themselves to be spiritual in some sense. Again, something we'll talk about. But also, just in terms of the broad paranormal, this is something that was rather interesting. More than 90% of them believe in ghosts or spirits. Notice that I said 90% are not atheists, 10% are atheists, but more than 90% believes in ghosts or some spirits. What that means is that some of the self-identified atheists still believe in ghosts and spirits. Now,
and what's interesting when you look at the body of work that Kristen Bell is doing and the types of conversations she is trying to facilitate in the culture is there's really no sign of atheism here. It's still the case that in many respects, atheists are not that cool. To be cool, you should be spiritual. But the question is, what is that spiritual going to mean? One of the interesting things is I plan to do more videos around Nathan's project, especially the project with the religious unaffiliated. I think this is one of the key areas that he is so helpful in, given his background, given the research that he's done, given the filming that he's done. Is what really is moving is the definition of religion. Because the question is, what can and cannot religion impinge on people? And one of the real questions here that's going on is, and this is of course deep within the Christian Reformed Church, deep within many Christian denominations, is it valid for your religion to impinge on your sexual desires? And if so, in what way? Now, those of you who know me tend to know that even though I, on one hand, have a reputation of being a very nice guy, I do have a pattern of being a little bit of a troll and provoking things. And I recently caused sort of a surprising blow up on CRC Voices when I posted this tweet by Rick Steves with respect to the election. Let's see if we can, if this will take us to said Twitter. I continue to use it by its traditional name, not its new name. A letter from a bishop to you via me. I get emails all the time from a bishop. My girlfriend, Shelley, is a Lutheran bishop. As a bishop, Shelley oversees a synod of about 100 churches in the northwest corner of Washington state. A bishop's responsibilities are similar to those of a superintendent who oversees all the schools in a particular school district. You have to explain this to people. This is ELCA, an ELCA Lutheran church, for those of you who have understanding about denominational alphabets. But Rick Steves has been her boyfriend for about 5 or 6 years. And I mentioned just casually on CRC Voices that the expectation basically culturally with respect to their relationship, both of them are divorced, both of them have children from a previous marriage. The expectation and the assumption would be that these two are sexually active, if not in fact living together. That's basically what the cultural conversation means about what a boyfriend or a girlfriend is out there in the broader culture. But does that impact religious communities? Well, there are several families of Lutheran churches. Shelley is a leader in what's by far the biggest and most progressive branch, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA. And she goes on to write in these times of angry politics, hard divisions, and hyper-political churches, he just finished saying she's a pastor of the most progressive church, and now suddenly churches that are hyper-political, no thank you. Wait a minute, you just characterized her whole denomination in that way. But let's continue. I feel that when unchurched Americans think of Christians, many think of extremely conservative ones who play such a high-profile role in the right wing of our political landscape. While the term evangelical can apply to a broad range of Christians, the most politicizings have come to be known as evangelical. So now he's sort of doing a little bit of protection because she's part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, but we really don't want you to think that that word evangelical and Evangelical Lutheran Church means what it means when you hear it on the lips of Fox or MSNBC or CNN or ABC, or because that has a political valence. On the other hand, the quieter wing of Christianity in our country, mainline Protestant denominations like Lutherans, Methodists, and Episcopalians, and many others, tend to be more liberal. In these churches, women and gay pastors are commonplace. Sanctity of life includes much more than a fetus. Our Jewish and Muslim neighbors are welcome, and we understand that all people are children of God and therefore equally beloved. Sadly, while noisy and angry fundamentalists and Christian nationalists grab the headlines and stoke the culture wars that divide our country, the rest of us who take love thy neighbor seriously. This is a non-political message, just in case any of you feel. And then he goes on, and then he has the letter of the bishop, and then he has their pictures together. And of course, this sort of caused a firestorm, or it starts because a little bit of a blowout on Voices, which I sort of took me by surprise because I was like, oh, so this, as you vote, who is your neighbor? As you vote, who is the stranger? As you vote, who is speaking truth? As you vote, who is caring for creation? Bishop Shelley Bryan, we. And it was really interesting to me, sort of the relationship between this sitcom, where it's sort of the right kind of synagogue, and this that is the right kind of Christian. And it just brings into the conversation. So then I made the comment, I said, what does it mean that a female bishop can have a long-term boyfriend, and then, how do you know they're sleeping together, and who's, are we going to start looking into the bedrooms of people, and I did mention, of course, Andrew Cuomo having to leave the governorship of the state of New York and everything that's around that. So the question is, well, what is spirituality and what is religion? And actually, one of the most interesting things as I listened to Nathan's conversation about the religiously unaffiliated is the changing definition of religion. What does it mean to be religious?
Really does fit with this trend. So today I want to talk about the evolution of a nun. I hate to have to do this again, but people are always confused by this term. The religiously unaffiliated are typically called nuns. And here we don't mean N-U-N, as in a Catholic or an Orthodox nun. We mean N-O-N-E, none of the above. It comes from religion surveys. They check none of the above on a religion survey. They don't have any religious affiliation. So when you hear me say nun, I mean people with no religious affiliation. So today I want to talk about the evolution of a nun. What are the stages that they go through? I'm going to talk first by way of prelude about the predictive patterns. What are the things that serve to clue us in that a person is on a trajectory to abandon religion? And there's
Now, I'm going to play some of these patterns because what's interesting is not only are we talking about, let's say, sort of from the established chairs in the audience that are obviously shifting around, people who are leaving a religion, but what on earth do we mean by religion?
actually plenty of data on that. And then we'll talk about the stages they go through. And what's interesting, we'll even talk about the fourth stage of this evolution, which is the return to religion. What does that look like and why do people do it? So that's on the docket today. So before we talk specifically about the 4 stages of the evolution of a nun, we need to do this prelude on what are the predictive factors, which is rather informative. And here I want to talk about, well, I'm only going to talk about 3 of the 4 predictive factors. The 3 factors I'll call, just for quick and easy reference, experiential factors, existential factors, cognitive factors. Now, there are theological factors, worldview factors. I'll touch on that briefly, but that's probably worthy of its own discussion that maybe we'll have some other time. Now, with that said, let's begin by looking at the experiential factors that predict whether someone's on a trajectory to abandon religion. A lot of what I'm going to talk about here in this early stage, the experiential factors, is based on the research of Smith and Sakink, who collated decades and decades of surveys and other research in order to identify these trends. So let's talk specifically about experiential trends at home. And so these are probably not terribly surprising once we call them out, but statistically speaking, we have plenty of data to support it. The first factor is the question of whether or not you have sort of what we'll call religious homogeny in the home. I noticed this right away when I was doing interviews with nuns in preparation for my documentary on the religiously unaffiliated. Most of the nuns had at home growing up one parent who was highly religious and one who was like, I'll go to church sometime begrudgingly, but I don't really believe in it. I'm not really part of this. This isn't really my thing. Or they were just outright, they didn't believe in it. What's interesting.
And right away, now, the link for the whole thing is below, and it's all well worth watching. But the point of all this is that, of course, religion is about practice. It's about what you do and what you don't do, and how you stick with it. And again, we're talking about religions generically. We're talking about Christian, Jewish, Muslim. But We should also sort of expand that, because those, of course, are the major organized world religions, but we also use the word like so-and-so does such and such religiously, which means that it's not the fact that they have a norm or an abstract norm, but they have a governing norm. And so a lot of these are, did your parents have governing norms? Did your parents agree to the governing norms? Did your parents use the governing norms, not only practice out there in public in their church world, but also in the home, in their private world? Did these governing norms actually govern? And if these governing norms governed, and they did so as a child, and you had a relatively good growing up as a child, generally speaking, you will continue to hold to those governing norms. And as you hear that, you will probably recognize that, well, that's actually goes beyond even what we call so-called religious. Again, you can look at the work of Christian Smith, Soul Searching, a book that I reference fairly often. What you discover there is that, in fact, even people that grew up without something that they could point to as a religion grew up with a moral system and a worldview that they basically inherited from their parents. And then even when certain aspects of it move over time, they will continue to hold good, bad, right, and wrong, sort of according to their parents, because if it worked for their parents, they'll think it works for them, which is a lot of what happens here, because, of course, she grows up in a relatively chaotic situation. Her and her sister, podcaster, have difficulty landing a stable relationship. They both admit fairly often to dating the wrong men, and now she's attracted to someone from a religious background. But the questions are going to be, what on earth are we dealing with here? And again, what is interesting is that, at least at this level of society, whether the high status man you've been able to attract is a PBS travel blogger or a hot rabbi, what is the background and what is the foreground? What a lot of this has to do is what I talked with Vocal Distance about. He was talking about the background and the network, because let's just listen to it first.
What he's seeing is, so Searle talks about the background, the network, and the network of intentionality is all the ideas, all of your intentional conscious content, right? Everything that's about something, dreams, visions, ideas, thoughts, goals, all the artifacts of consciousness, the things that furnish your conscious world and your ideas. That's right. Intentionality just means ofness or aboutness. So anytime you have a thought of something or about something, that's intentionality. Yep. And he's saying you have a network of intentionality, all of these intentional bits of intentionality of knowing things and feeling things and having thoughts.
And you would understand that, on one hand, a religion, at least if you identify as self-consciously religious, if you identify as participating in this established thing, that is all part of the network of intentionality.
About things and imagination, and all of that forms a network of intentionality, and that gets meaning up against a background, and the background is a set of capacities, things like knowing a language, having a prefrontal cortex, being able to see, having senses, the capacity to use language, the ability to think. And the background, and he says this in his book on perception, he says there's no hard and fast line between the background and the network, just like there's no hard and fast line between a tree and its roots. They kind of bleed into each other,
right? And that's where religion is a very slippery thing, because what's interesting about, let's say, what the mom is worried about, let's find the mom again, what the mom is worried about is the affordances. Because in a religious community, you're actually dealing with something that is multi-generational. It travels through history. And what its norms, its networks of intentionality desires to do is afford over time this background. Now, as Grim Grizz says, television is a normalizing ray. And so what's interesting here is that, you know, the mutual friend can say, oh, she doesn't have a Jewish bone on. She doesn't have a Jewish bone in her unless you put one in her. Wink, wink. That's the normalizing ray. The normalizing ray is she's your girlfriend. You sleep with a girlfriend. That's what a girlfriend is. And so even, you know, it's just so interesting that in a religious community, everyone's freaking the heck out because I would say, well, I assume they're sleeping together. Well, how do you know? And maybe they're not. And it's like, okay, do you really want to play that game? Because I don't really care if they're sleeping together or not. What I care about is what on earth is the background and what on earth is the network of intentionality. Because that's actually what we're negotiating in a story like this. And there's absolutely no conversation in the story as to whether or not these two should be having sex. It's unimportant. They're going to movies. They're eating together. They're doing all these things. And this is where then we knock on the door of Louise Perry land. So in her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, Louise Perry boils it down fairly succinctly. Talks about Marilyn Monroe, Hugh Hefner. I'm going to argue in this book that Western sexual culture in the 21st century doesn't properly balance these interests. Instead, it promotes the interest of Hugh Hefners of the world at the expense of Marilyn Monroe's. And the interest of liberal feminism means that too many women don't recognize this truth, blithely accepting Hefner's claim that all the downsides of the new sexual culture are just a small price to pay for personal freedom, which suits the likes of Hefner very nicely, since playboys like him have a lot to gain from the new sexual culture. It is in their interest to push a particularly radical idea about sex that has come out of the sexual revolution as proved remarkably influential despite its harms. This is the idea that sex is nothing more than a leisure activity invested with meaning only if the participants choose to give it meaning. Now, of course, at the heart of this whole show is, in fact, meaning. What is the meaning of their relationship? What is the meaning of all of this? But what sits at the center of the show, in many ways, can't be spoken. Anyway, let me know what you think. Leave a comment.